Folger moves on in, and he scores! He's gonna learn today.
What's happening, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Pod Street Bullies. My name is Derek.
And I am John. What's going on, everybody?
And we have a very special guest joining us here today. We have Mr. Mike Commito. Mike, tell everybody hello.
How's it going? Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. So we've had you on before, but for some of the listeners that aren't familiar with your work, let us know a little bit about what you do here.
Yeah, so I'm, a hockey historian, hockey writer, hockey author. I do a lot of my writing for the LA Kings at lakings.com. I also wrote a book a couple years ago called Hockey 365. It has 365 short hockey history stories, one for every day of the year. So a lot of my social media focuses on, promoting the game's history, kind of looking back into the past and seeing, what we can take from history and better help us contextualize what's happening on the ice these days, although there's not a lot happening on the ice these days. But if you want to find all my work and all my social or all my hockey history nuggets, you can go to @MikeCommito on Twitter.
And you have some of the best hockey history nuggets out there.
Oh, for sure. I was going to say, for anybody who's not following Mike, who's a hockey fan, you have to follow Mike because every day there's at least a handful of just great hockey knowledge that you provide, man. It's really just a great thing to read every day.
Thanks. I find that there's been a bit of an uptick lately. Obviously, I think people are hockey starved, so I've noticed that I think the tweets are going farther than they normally do. I mean, I'm always good for the odd banger here or there, but I feel like every day there's at least something that goes off more than it probably should because I think people are just looking for any kind of hockey content, and blasts from the past are always fun.
I feel their pain.
Yes, I saw Spit and Chicklets picked up one of your tweets the other day. I can't recall which one.
I can't. I'm trying to think. It had to be something maybe related to. There's been a couple in the past with Ryan Malone related, but I don't think that was one recently. I can't recall, but I wish I would have known. That would have made this point a little bit better that I had. But I can't recall.
No, but that's pretty neat. I mean, and like you said, we're all hockey starved. We're all looking for something to discuss with the people we typically interact with on Twitter, which brings us to our point that we want to talk about today.
Derek,
John's going to segue here.
I'm going to cut you off for a second. Just
Surprise.
Real quick, Mike, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So on the NHL Network now, right, it's all old games. A few weeks ago I was watching, I think, 1989 Stanley Cup. Being a hockey historian, do you enjoy watching the old games, or are you like, eh?
No, I actually saw this, like somebody was talking about this on Twitter the other day about how they're not a fan of watching old games. I think I'm of the mind where if it's a game that I can't reasonably have expected to ever have watched in my time on this earth, then I'll watch it. I mean, even before, I can actually recall this, before all this stuff happened, I was at a bar probably a few months ago with a buddy, and they were playing an old Oilers game. And I had obviously never seen it because I know it was from like 85, 86 season. And it's just, I like going back and just kind of seeing how the game was played at that point. I mean, I've seen a lot of those clips over the years, obviously going back and watching, what I can. But I mean, I think I get a kick out of it. Obviously, I'm not making plans to sit down and have my wife sit through a North Stars game. She knows that you're going to know the results and who cares. But it's fun, I think, when you're kind of passing through just to kind of see just how much the game has changed and how different it was back then.
Oh, for sure. And now I find myself like hoping I don't know the result of the game. I pray that I don't know the final score of this game so I can enjoy it just a little bit more. But I'm the same way. These days I will watch anything.
Yeah, because I mean, a lot of the teams I think have been doing re-airs of games from this past season. But I mean, if you've watched the game already this season,
right,
as much as I'm hockey starved, like I'm not going to sit through another game where not only have I watched it already, but I definitely know the outcome. And
exactly,
I've read about the outcome in other ways as well, right? So,
right. Like 80s or 90s. All right, Derek, you can talk now.
Yeah, but much to your point here, too, what's interesting to me is that some of these teams are broadcasting actual, like, NHL 20, like the video game simulations. The Flyers just did it with the Penguins, which, I mean, it's kind of, you either love it or you hate it.
It's a little much.
Yeah.
That's a little much.
I mean, what's your take on that,
yeah,
Mike? Like, do you enjoy that?
I've been kind of watching. Like, I think the Kings were one of the first ones to start doing that, on their Twitch account, and I would kind of follow it on Twitter when they'd post clips here and there. But again, I also haven't played NHL the series in a little bit, so I'm not as big on the video games. I think it's cool for sure the first little while when, we weren't having hockey for the second or third straight week. But at this point, again, I think much to my point earlier that I am hockey star, but I'm not, I'm not going to watch a full Twitch feed just to kind of get my fix as to how this, simulated, hockey game is going online.
Right.
Agreed. I'm with you. It was cool at first, but now it's like, I've had enough of this. I want the real thing. But if we're going to get to the real thing here, we want to talk about what's happening right now. Obviously, we know that the season has been suspended until further notice, really. And this is not the first time that this has happened. And that's why we're having Mike on. Being the hockey historian that he is, he knows about prior seasons where seasons have either started late, ended early. Sometimes the Stanley Cup wasn't even awarded. And we wanted to get into some of these seasons and talk about maybe a couple similarities between now and then. And, just kind of harp on a few of those seasons where play was missed, essentially. And we're going to go, first off, all the way back. We want to go to the 1918-1919 season. And it was the season of the Spanish flu. So there was a pandemic going on like there is now. And Mike, I want you to tell us a little bit, kind of some general knowledge about that season and how it kind of unfolded.
Yeah, so obviously at that time, as you'd mentioned, the Spanish flu, influenza pandemic that was gripping the world after the end of the First World War, with soldiers and people kind of returning to where they came from. They're bringing back this virus, and by the end of the pandemic, there had been more than 50 million people that died. So again, very much, a global killer, so to speak. And even as far as the NHL was concerned, hockey wasn't immune from the effects of that. Even before that season started, Hamby Shore, who played for the Ottawa Senators, he died, before the 1918-19 campaign. But really, I think what obviously draws the similarities to what we're going on right now with the COVID-19 pandemic is how it impacted the play of the Stanley Cup final. So, back in those days, the way it worked, the NHL league champion would go on and play, the Pacific Coast Hockey Association champion. And so in this case, in 1919, it was the Montreal Canadiens and the Seattle Metropolitans. And these two teams, had played 2 years earlier in 1917. And Seattle actually won that time, becoming the first American-based club to win the Stanley Cup. And so they go on to have this rematch in 1919 in the middle of this influenza pandemic. And they play 5 games. The series ends up getting tied 2-1. But while they're playing this series and getting ready for that 6th and deciding game, players are getting sick. You had 5 players, including the Canadiens owner George Kennedy, who were kind of over in a hotel that had been converted into kind of like a hospital, sort of, where they were battling fevers and things like that as they kind of combated the flu. And as they're kind of starting to realize that it's likely that this series is not going to be able to be played because you've got 4 or 5 Canadiens players who are completely out of commission. The Stanley Cup trustees had offered to give Seattle the cup, but they had refused. They obviously didn't want to win it that way. They wanted to actually, win it on the ice in that 6th and deciding game. But after, I think, assessing the situation and realizing that this was very serious and these players were very sick, the league had canceled the 6th and deciding game. And so that was the first time, obviously, outside of the lockout now in 2004-05, where the Stanley Cup was never awarded. And it's kind of, I think, obviously, it hits a little more. It's a little more devastating than just not awarding the cup. A few days later today, when we're talking, it's the 101st anniversary of when Joe Hall, whose nickname was the Bullet, he died of pneumonia, brought on by complications of battling the flu. And so he was a the Montreal Canadiens. And even in addition to Joe, the Canadiens owner who I'd mentioned earlier, George Kennedy, he battled it as well with his players at the time. And while he got over his bout of the flu at that point, his health never fully recovered, and he ended up passing away in the fall of 1921 due to those health complications of having influenza. And I think the most somber reminder of that season that never was officially finished is that it's still engraved on the Stanley Cup, where you have 1919 Montreal Canadiens, Seattle Metropolitans, and then below it is just the inscription that says "Series not completed."
Oh wow!
It's an interesting tidbit there. Yeah, that's very sombering.
Mike, I have a question. When you said they were going to reward it to Seattle, why were they going to give it to Seattle and not Montreal?
That's a good question. I don't know the exact rationale because, I mean, the other way you could look at it, Seattle just won it 2 years earlier against Montreal, right? So it's not as if like it was a situation where the other team had won before and we're going to kind of give it to you as a show of good faith. I mean, I think maybe just some goodwill or some old-fashioned Canadian hospitality. Given the fact that the series was tied and maybe they felt you could flip a coin and the right thing to do, considering Lord Stanley donated to be like a championship trophy for a Canadian team when he originally did it. Maybe that's why. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure as to what the rationale was as to why they decided they would want to offer it to Seattle over, let's say, just giving it to Montreal and kind of going their separate ways.
Could you imagine that happening today?
Now, from my research here, it seems that Montreal tried to forfeit the series because what I read was that after Pete Muldoon, the owner of Seattle, had been contacted by the Montreal franchise, Muldoon actually suggested to them that they try to get some players from the Victoria Aristocrats, my apologies. Yeah. And the NHL president at that time, Frank Calder, refused the idea and they canceled the series right then and there.
Yeah, no, I remember that part because, I mean, even there was earlier in the season, Montreal had played a game against Victoria, and that's when they started to see some of the side effects of the flu, and it's first started to kind of creep into, I think, onto the NHL's radar. But yeah, I think ultimately when that failed and they realized they weren't going to be able to bring in other players, that's kind of when I think the idea of salvaging it kind of hit the skids.
Yeah, and I mean, you think about it these days, it's very, to say that a team might not be awarded the Stanley Cup, how, I guess, I'm at a loss for words here. Like, how interesting is that? Thinking about it, and you look back on this, let's say, 20, 30 years from now, and you're like, oh, 2020, nobody won the Stanley Cup. Like, how weird is that going to be that there's kind of that gap in history?
Yeah, I think it's definitely going to be an interesting time for sure because, I mean, we've seen it when it wasn't awarded in 2005, but we kind of had a feeling, the season never had started, right? So, I mean, I think the fact that we played like 70 games or so, and there's a very strong likelihood that we don't get to have the remainder of the season played. And it's looking less and less likely that there's going to be a way to kind of do a playoffs in time to then have another season the following year. So, I mean, it's going to be one of those really weird things. And how do you kind of reconcile all the, everything that happened this year and all the work that the teams had done to try to get to the point to be competitive, to win, all the players who put in all that work. I mean, ultimately all those stats will still remain with them, but it's just going to be another one of those kind of lost seasons where it's going to be kind of hard to make sense of if that's what ends up happening.
Yeah, very unfortunate. I mean, and especially for some of the teams, I mean, you're losing a year of some of these guys' primes. So unfortunately, as it may be, that's the case right now, and that's kind of the barrel we're looking down.
Yeah. Before we move on to the next topic or the next work stoppage, sorry, having a hard time speaking over here. Mike, so 1919, how long had the Stanley Cup been awarded before that?
So the first time it was awarded was in 1893.
Okay.
The first official year, though, that two teams had competed for was the following year in 1894. And so the NHA and then eventually the NHL, essentially took custody of the Stanley Cup through the Stanley Cup trustees. But up until that point, that was when the NHL was playing. The Stanley Cup was still being awarded by the champion of that NHL team taking on the West champion, the rights to the Cup.
Right, so the Stanley Cup had already had some decent history by the time 1919 came around.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Hey, so then moving on to the next season where time was missed, we do have the 1992 player strike. This is a player strike. This was not there's labor disputes, there's lockouts. This was a player strike. So tell us a little bit about the 1992 season here, Mike.
Well, actually, I'm going to take you back because this is one of the things where I always remember this whenever we talk about that 1992 player strike. It was, the first player strike in league history, but the caveat there is that there was a player strike way back in 1924-25, although it was just with one team. So I'm going to quickly take you through the Hamilton Tigers because I think it's a pretty cool story. So the Hamilton Tigers, they had started the 1924-25 season red hot. They were 10-4-1. They'd finished 19-10-1, so they were first in the league, which is Hamilton's best finish yet. Probably the best position to win the Stanley Cup in the franchise's history. The problem for the players that they had was that leading up to that season, the NHL had increased the number of games, and so they went from 24 games in a season to 30. And the players had felt that that was unfair because they weren't getting compensated for those 6 additional games. So heading into the playoffs that year, thinking maybe that they had some leverage because they were the first seed, they demanded an extra $200 for those 6 games, or they wouldn't play in the playoffs. The owners refused to pay that additional $200 to each of their players, and so the players went on strike. And while the players were on strike, the number 2, number 3 seeds at the time were Montreal and Toronto, and they were playing a 2-series total goals to see who would go on to play Hamilton in the final. And then while they're playing this series, Montreal ends up winning that series. The players' strike ends up they don't find a resolution, and the league just decides to just award the league championship to Montreal because they beat Toronto. So Hamilton doesn't. They end up actually folding. That was the last time they were in the NHL. That obviously the conflict with the players kind of led to the downfall of the team that was already struggling at that point. And so Montreal then ends up going on to play the Victoria Cougars for the Cup. Victoria wins, and that was actually the last time that a non-NHL team won the Stanley Cup. But again, another one of those quirky, it's not talked about a lot because it was only one team and it was back in 24-25. But I think when we talk about the players' strike, it's always cool to bring up the Tigers and their failed attempt to try to get some more money, which ultimately could have cost them a Stanley Cup, or at least a chance for a Stanley Cup.
Yeah, that is interesting.
I always like taking some of these stories and then trying to put them into like present day. And it's like, could you just imagine the Philadelphia Flyers one day being like, nah, you know what? This isn't cutting it anymore. We don't feel like playing. Like, that's just so wild.
Yeah.
When you think about the compensation, though, I mean, let's be honest. It's like, one of us going into our day jobs and they're like, hey, we're going to have you work Saturday, but we're not going to pay you for it. Like, that doesn't seem too fair to me.
Sounds like teaching.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I won't say that again.
So 1992, let's get on this. Let's talk about what happened that season, Mike.
Yeah, so that would have been the first league-wide strike. Again, first time in 75 years in the NHL's history. It ended up lasting 10 days. And one of the key issues in that was obviously it's always over revenue, but in this case it was kind of over player likeness. They wanted to make sure that they had exclusivity over that when it came to hockey cards and other things with merchandise. Ultimately, also kind of increasing they wanted increased playoff funds. And we were talking earlier about wanting more money for games played. They were looking for an increased share of revenue generated during the playoffs. They were also looking to ease some of the free agent restrictions, which is obviously an ongoing thing that we'll kind of see when we talk about the other labor stoppages in the coming conversations. But ultimately, they do resolve it. Some of the key things that happen is that the season, the following year gets extended from 80 to 84 games. One of the interesting things I think, just from we always talk about how is the NHL season too long? Should we be playing hockey in June? Because of this 10-day strike, it pushes playoffs into June for the first time, and so we're having the Stanley Cup final. Between with Pittsburgh being played in June for the first time ever, and then obviously that ends up becoming a hallmark of the NHL playoffs, is that it's there's always hockey in June now, right? It depends on how late it goes into the month, but since '92, there hasn't been a year where I don't think we've had a game that hasn't gone all the way into at least the early part, if not the middle part of June. And obviously, it does shake things up. The NHL owners end up replacing John Ziegler, who was the president at the time, with Jill Stein, and ultimately after that, Gary Bettman comes in, right? And then we kind of have that thread that'll link us through the other stories that we kind of talk about.
Yeah. This is the one lockout that led to Gary Bettman taking over. So this is my least favorite lockout.
I have a question, and maybe this is a dumb question, but after something like this, right? And I'm obviously not going to really talk about the 1924 one because it was so long ago, but after something like this, has the league put something in place to kind of prevent like an in-season strike from taking place? Like, are there any like contractual obligations where that's not, like, they're not allowed to do it? I don't know if that's a stupid question, but I'm just curious.
No, I don't think it's a stupid question. I don't have the answer for that. I mean, ultimately, I think if there was something that was so unfavorable to the players and, they could exercise their do a wildcat strike and completely walk out. I mean, there's nothing that would prevent anybody from doing that. But as far as if there's anything written in the collective agreement that would prohibit something like that, I mean, ultimately, I think within your right to to bargain and your right to strike, that there are you have those options, right? But as far as the wording, that's a question for someone much smarter than me.
Now, I found something really interesting with this as well. You were talking about the payouts for the playoff performances, and before this, from what the research that I was doing says, players would get $3,000 for a first round exit, $25,000 for winning the cup, while owners, and this is per playoff game, owners got $500,000 per playoff game.
That's a little one-sided.
Yeah, a little bit.
Exactly. So you almost tend to side with the players because it's like, these guys are getting pennies on the dollar for what the owners are getting. So, how can you say, oh, well, the owners have a fair argument here when you look at those numbers and then obviously the end result with the lockout, the players get kind of what they want in regards to bigger payouts for playoff performances as well. Trading card revenue, it was at $16 million from trading cards, and the players wanted their fair share of that for their likeness being used. This is one of those things. It's like, it's like the underdog versus David versus Goliath, you could say, with Goliath obviously being the owners. These guys just wanted to be paid accordingly for what the league was kind of making off of them already. It's almost remnant of the NCAA making ridiculous profits off the players that play in college.
Yeah, no, I think it was definitely within reason, absolutely, given, especially with player likeness. I mean, if you're going to be profiting off of what these guys are doing on the ice and, with their, how much the fans are kind of, buying their stuff and gravitating towards them, ultimately, you've got to make sure that the people who are generating that for you are properly compensated.
Absolutely. You have marketable players. People want their stuff, and that's the people that are the products that are being bought with these people's likeness on it. They want to be compensated for it. It's a hard time arguing against that. But we move on from the 1992 player strike to the lockout. And I keep saying lockout. 1992 was a player strike. This in 1994-95 is a lockout. Let us hear about the 1994-95 lockout here.
Yeah, so this is Bettman's first, so you're welcome there. It was 102 days. And again, while free agency was a part of this one as well, I think the bigger one was obviously avoiding a salary cap, from the player's perspective. And so the owners were pushing for a cap or at least some sort of, payroll structure that would kind of, lock things into place. Ultimately, the players do avoid a salary cap this time around, but what they do agree to is a rookie salary cap, and they do agree to some new salary arbitration structuring when it comes to negotiating new deals and things. As far as the free agency, it was still a big, part of that conversation. One of the concessions they did get was that through the course of this, 6-year deal that ended up coming out of that lockout was that in the first 3 years of that new collective agreement, you could hit free agency at the age of 32, which again is also crazy now when we think about when players are hitting free agency in their prime now. And then in the latter half of that agreement, you would hit free agency at the age of 31. So that was allowing players, I think, to get to pursue their options a little more quickly, which is obviously something that we're still seeing now is that players want to be able to kind of explore their options. And so those are some of the key things for me. I think one of the other interesting things about this strike, and it doesn't obviously have any similarities right now because, this was a labor stoppage, but at the same time, there was a baseball strike. And so there was a lot of sports that wasn't happening, in that fall time of year, right? So one of the interesting things for other leagues like the AHL and the IHL was that they were really, some of the only products on ice, and there was no baseball being happening right now. So some of the teams were able to capitalize on this because you had people who would otherwise be going to NHL games, otherwise maybe going to MLB games. And they're not doing either of those, so they're going out checking AHL games or checking out IHL games and things like that. So that's kind of interesting. That one of the only times when we're going to talk about NHL work stoppages where there's another league that's not playing at the same time, right? So I think that. In that case, it helped maybe some of the other hockey that was being played, but ultimately doesn't have an impact on what happened in the NHL. I think one of the other things I'll throw in quickly for you guys, just because I know this is obviously a Flyers podcast, just to kind of touch on what I thought was interesting, what some of the Flyers were doing during this lockout. Lindros went back to Toronto. he was taking an economics course. But I think what the more interesting one was Kevin Dineen was playing for the Houston Aeros of the IHL, and he was signed by his brother, who I think his name was Peter. And so after he signed his brother, the IHL looking to not, kind of step on the NHL's toes by signing more NHL players, had decided that after that they weren't going to allow that anymore. So any players that were locked up in the NHL would not be able to sign an IHL contract. So just Kevin got to do that. He kind of joked with reporters when he got back that it was known as the Kevin Dineen rule. Whether or not that's true, I'm not sure, but it sounds good considering he was the last player to sign an agreement and play in the IHL that year.
That's pretty neat.
Is the IHL the league that had the first Vegas team?
Yes, yeah, the Vegas Thunder.
Awesome.
Right.
So basic points from this one is Bettman wanted aggressive expansion, a new American TV deal, focus on growth of the product specific to the southern United States, and lasting labor peace under the owners' terms. So basically what he was looking for is obviously the aforementioned expansion, southern U.S. TV deal, but lasting labor peace under the owners' terms. Mike, to you, does that sound kind of like him trying to rule with more of an iron fist, saying, we're going to do things my way, we're going to do things the owners' way? That doesn't seem too fair to me, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
No, and I mean, I think you can make a pretty strong argument that it's not, but ultimately that's kind of what I think, obviously people take issue with Bettman and a lot of his tactics, but in many respects, his job is to kind of carry out the will of the owners, right? And for them, they're going to be doing what is in the best interest for them. I mean, obviously they're going to have to make some concessions to their players, but ultimately, at the end of the day, it's really about them and what they're getting back, and not necessarily what is right or what's fair for those players.
You're right. And another interesting tidbit here, Toronto, Detroit, the Rangers, Dallas, and Philadelphia all broke with the league because they feared an extended lockout could outweigh the benefits from getting a salary cap. They didn't want to be the first North American professional sports league to forfeit an entire season, because the motive here seemed to be Bettman wanted to help out the smaller market teams in the league. So, if we wanted to tie it into the Flyers here, because obviously being a Flyers podcast, I thought that was pretty interesting because Philadelphia just kind of said, hey, we're not dealing with this along with 4 other teams, just because you want to help out these smaller teams. We're a big team. We're good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I mean, ultimately they were able to save the season, so to speak. It was 102 days they were locked out, but ultimately able to come back in time and have that 40-game regular season before going into the playoffs.
Yeah.
So one question that I have is, you have this work stoppage in the players' strike in 92, and then you have this lockout in 94, 95. There's not a lot of time between those two things. Does the league's popularity take a hit because of this?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think for the league, the timing of that is unfortunate. I mean, especially when you have like 94, the Rangers win the Cup, which again, you can have your opinion on whether or not that was a good thing or not, depending on what colors you wear. But ultimately, the NHL is trying to capitalize on that. Bettman is obviously very much, focused on expansion. Those new teams that he's brought in, those TV deals. I mean, ultimately, these are the worst things that could happen, right? Is that you have this, which ultimately is only 10 days, and it's not great though when you have kind of unrest. But that lockout, as much as we talk about how that they're able to salvage the season, and I think the players kind of came away from it a little bit better in the future years. That does have a serious impact, right? I mean, you turn the fans off. I remember going back, kind of trying to brush up for this conversation today, and you're reading what the fans' perspectives on this is, right? And it doesn't take long for fans to kind of, as much as we, in our conversation, we can kind of see that, we side with the players on a lot of these issues, but as a fan of the game, you just want to get that product back on the ice and you want to cheer for your favorite team, right? So by the end of this, you don't really care whether or not it's fair. You just want to see your favorite team play. And the players and the owners be damned, right? And so you've seen it in past years, I think more recently, where fans kind of turn their backs. And I mean, ultimately, how long they actually do that for is kind of dependent on the individual. You can easily turn and kind of take that goodwill that you've been building for the last couple of years and kind of squash it, right? And so I think for Bettman, this is definitely not something he wanted to have because, again, with his mind focused on expansion, getting into kind of those Sunbelt areas and really kind of getting those TV deals. This is the worst thing you could do is essentially turn off your sport for half the season.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
sorry.
At least, no, sorry. At least it would kind of set him up for the next few lockouts that this guy would go through, huh?
Oh yeah, a grizzled vet by the time we get to present day.
Oh yeah,
crazy.
Bettman is no stranger to a lockout, and as evidenced by the next point we have, the 2004-2005 NHL lockout. Like you had mentioned before, a lot of the same arguing points, you could say, the salary cap, things of that nature. But run us through, I guess, the 2004-2005 lockout here, Mike.
Yeah, so again, the salary cap kind of comes back and rears its ugly head. I mean, for Bettman and the owners, the key thing that they wanted out of this was a salary cap, but more broadly, cost certainty for the league. And so what they really wanted was a salary cap that was tied to league revenue. The players, not that they necessarily wanted a salary cap, but they didn't want, obviously that to tethering it to league revenue, right? They wanted something that was fixed, that wasn't kind of dependent on, how well the league did and kind of altering the system from there. And so that was really the focus, going into it. This is one of those ones where as it kind of drags on, it's becoming apparent that it's not looking good. There's some talks that happen, go on for hours and then break down. And then ultimately we get the word on February 16th, 2005, that they are canceling the season, thereby becoming the first, pro sports league in North America to cancel an entire season, right? So this is the second time now. We go back to that 1919 season where there would be no Stanley Cup. Ultimately, they end up reaching their agreement in July of 2005. And I think the other thing that's worth noting here is that, prior to reaching that in July, there was talk that this might go in and kind of take away some of the games from the following season, right? It wasn't certain that they would resolve this in time, and we maybe, it was looking like there could be another interruption, that maybe this will kind of go into the 2005-2006 season. Luckily, that doesn't happen. And so they reached that agreement. They do bring in the salary cap finally. But I think some of the other things that is obviously the salary cap is I think the most significant piece to kind of come out of this. But just for the play on the ice, obviously the lockout really kind of changes things. They remove the red line, which ultimately allows for those two line passes, which ultimately speeds up the game. They're cracking down on obstruction, getting rid of ties is another big thing, and so. A lot of things, obviously, that changed the structure of the league, but also the play of the league as well, which I think is interesting.
And you have a couple interesting things coming with this. They announced the cancellation of the season on the 16th of February. 2 days later, apparently the Hockey News reported that a deal with a $45 million cap was made, but then immediately after that happened, both sides, the owners and the players, denied the report, and then had a 6.5-hour meeting, still no agreement, and the season was officially lost. I mean, being a member of the media, obviously with you, Mike, it's kind of irresponsible to report something like that. Am I wrong?
Yeah, and who knows what ends up happening in those backroom deals, right? Whether or not they had one and then it did fell through, or again, I'd have to go back and check out that report. But I think people are at that point just really hoping that the whole season wasn't going to be lost. And they did have a lot of those meetings that had dragged on, for hours upon hours. Whereas it's tough to say who a source was. Maybe they got it wrong, but I think maybe in that case I would kind of side with whoever's just trying to maybe whatever they'd heard, taking the silver lining towards it, potentially having a deal. But ultimately, we know that wasn't the case.
Oh yeah, and then you get to teams like Washington. Washington was having a fire sale of their players because they were losing so much money. Edmonton actually came out and publicly stated that they would have folded had it not been for this lockout. I mean, how dire of a situation was it for teams like this that they're actually thankful that there was a lockout?
Yeah, because you have teams like that who are saying that, if we had to pay our players for that entire season, right? That would have put the financial pinch. I think that's you've seen that in past lockouts as well, where ultimately after even the labor stoppage ends and we go back to play, you see the relocation of Canadian teams following that 1994-95 lockout, right? Yep. So ultimately, I think as much as it kind of gives these teams a reprieve, if you're having issues with attendance or financial issues, a lockout will kind of only grant you so much breathing room before ultimately, the chickens are going to come home to roost. And some of those underlying problems that are more systemic than anything else, where they're never really going to go away.
Absolutely. And John was going to add something here, it appears.
Was I?
I don't know. Maybe I'm just looking at Skype and I see your picture up like I thought you were talking, but maybe I'm mistaken.
Oh, no. I mean, I do have a question, but maybe it's better for the next lockout, but I'll ask it anyway. When does Gary Bettman's job start to get put into jeopardy? Or does it ever happen with any of these? I mean, the guy is a part of 3 lockouts. Do people start questioning whether or not he's the man to do this?
Well, I think among the fans, for sure. I mean, he's the face on the owner's side throughout these entire processes, right? But ultimately, I think the owners have kind of voted with, I forget what the expression is. They always say vote with your feet, but that doesn't really make any sense in this particular analogy, right? But they've bestowed their confidence in him after all these years, right? Ultimately, as much as the lost revenue by not having a season, he has done, I think, a decent job on their side at getting them what they're looking for. Ultimately, if it's not entirely what they want, but I think on their side and their perspective, he's done well by them. But again, that's just that one perspective, right? I mean, I think now 93 was when he came in, right? So he's been at this for 27 years, and he's continuing to do his job. So we'll see if at any point. But I can't recall if there was any tangible reports at the time saying whether or not he was losing favor with the owners in any of those 3 lockouts. It's possible that obviously you'd have maybe a disgruntled base, but ultimately I think that he's kind of carrying out the marching orders, so to speak. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's the interesting thing, because when you think of teams, right, the face or the head coach is always kind of the scapegoat, regardless of whether or not he's the reason that a team is failing, he's kind of the first one to go. And Gary Bettman is the face of the NHL. So it's just interesting that that same mentality doesn't apply, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
Yeah, and I guess one last tidbit, if we're going to tie this into the Flyers, loosely tied into the Flyers at that. Late in January of 2005, the hockey media's self-appointed point of no return. Negotiators took over 4 meetings later. There was no deal, and they cited philosophical differences. I thought that was kind of funny just because that was the reason why Hextall was fired, the philosophical differences.
Well, that is good, but I thought maybe you were going to go with something else, because I had a Flyers tie in here as well, just to kind of tie back to our previous point about what is the impact of these lockouts from the fan perspective. And so Roenick, who was with the Flyers at the time, was always pretty vocal during these lockouts. He was vocal in 1994-95, but obviously not quite to the extent in 2004-05. So I kind of want to read this one quote that he had, just because I think it kind of encapsulates how fans could initially be, I think, sympathetic to the players' cause, but then by the end of this, and again, salaries are one thing, but you have Roenick out here saying, everybody out there who calls us spoiled because we play a game, they can all kiss my ass. They can all kiss my ass because we've tried so hard to get this team back on the ice. So I mean, when I get the frustration on players, but ultimately when you come out and you start to tell fans, to stick somewhere. That doesn't really help anybody, right? And so I think that's kind of an interesting thing where, by the end of this, people's views kind of sour on things, especially when, these well-compensated athletes, right? And ultimately they are playing a game for our entertainment, but by the same token, you can only really kind of get so much, favor from the fans who at the end of the day will just kind of see these guys as highly compensated and really not doing their job at the time, right? So,
it kind of reminds me of a story that has nothing to do with hockey, but I'm going to tell it anyway.
This is the one sidebar you get tonight.
One sidebar. I know we have a guest. I'll only go one sidebar, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I think it was my freshman year of college. Over the summer, me and my buddies went to go see the Counting Crows play at an outdoor venue. You're both familiar with the Counting Crows, I assume? Yes?
Oh, of course.
Okay. So anyway, he comes out, and the lead singer is out there. And he comes out and he goes, "We don't care what you want to listen to. We're going to play whatever we damn well please." So he played maybe 1 or 2 hits, and people started walking out, and he was getting so angry. But it's dude, you can't. entertain and then tell the group of people, like, we don't really give a crap what you want to listen to. We're going to do whatever we want. So I know it really doesn't have to do with hockey, but it just reminded me, because Roenick is kind of like, screw the fans, and this guy was kind of like, screw the fans. And I don't like the Counting Crows anymore because he's a jerk.
It makes perfect sense.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a great way to start a concert. That's for sure.
Oh no! When you're playing all of like your B-sides, it's like, dude, come on,
like,
really?
This is not what we paid for.
Mr. Jones on repeat. That's what I came here for.
But yeah, back to the Roenick point too. I mean, let's be honest. JR's never been one to bite his tongue when it comes to controversial topics like this as well. No. But we get to the most recent lockout, and it's the 2012-2013, which we all remember. I can tell you exactly where I was when play resumed, because the first game of the Flyers season that year was against the Penguins, and I have never been more excited for hockey to begin. So run us through what happened here, what the owners wanted, players wanted, and how this thing got resolved here, Mike.
Yeah, and I'll just share quickly I remember exactly where I was through some of this as well. I was in Albany, New York, for part of this, because I was doing research for my PhD at the time, and I didn't think anything of it. I just knew that there was no NHL hockey, but then I realized while I was staying in Albany that the Albany Devils, obviously the New Jersey's affiliate, was there, and they were still playing. And so that night they were playing the Adirondack Phantoms, and so I went to check out that game alone. The first time ever I've been to a hockey game alone, which is fine. I mean, people go to the movies alone. I've never done it, but I hear that it's great.
It is great.
Going to a hockey game alone was fine too, although I don't think I was drinking as much as I would have liked to have been. I feel like you still need one more person to really kind of, anyway, but a long story short, the Phantoms lost, but there was 2 penalty shots that game, both goals. Adam Henrique scored, and then Zach Rinaldo scored. So
Rinaldo. Oof.
Yeah, he was on the score sheet for a different reason. So that's actually the only AHL game I've ever been to. But there you go. That's because of the 2012-13 lockout, where you had a lot more of those players on those teams that would probably otherwise maybe not necessarily have been playing, down in the A at the time, but obviously a good way for them to kind of keep developing.
You should have went to more Phantoms games where Ronaldo was playing. Maybe he would have ended up with being a little bit more successful on the score sheet.
I was actually in the Adirondacks, I was doing my research there, and then I was driving up to Albany, right? And so I actually at that point had not really kind of figured out where the Adirondacks were. So I would have liked to have caught a game there. I don't know where they played at the time, because it's not a very big community. But nevertheless, I digress. That's my one sidebar. So,
I love the Adirondacks. I actually go up there every summer. I live in New York, and they play in Glens Falls. I mean, the Adirondack Thunder are now the ECHL, but it's right by like the Saratoga area.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I can't remember. I was staying at I forgot. I was at the Adirondack Museum. I forget exactly where I was.
I've gone there before, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. My grandparents have taken me there a few times. I don't remember ever being too interested, but
yeah, I remember there was a lot of deer and a lot of wild turkeys. I remember.
Wild turkeys, like the animal, like the bird, or are we talking whiskey?
No. Unfortunately, this game is talking about.
All right, hockey.
Yeah, that's great. So we'll jump back to the 2012-13 lockout, and ultimately, now the salary cap is not as much of an issue anymore because we have one now. But the big thing here for the owners is reducing the players' share of hockey-related revenue. At the time, it was actually at 57%, so in the players' favor, getting some of that HRRR. And ultimately, one of the other things the owners wanted to do as well was kind of reduce contract lengths. They actually wanted to shorten them, I think from what I read, to as low as 4 years. They really wanted to extend that free agency eligibility period going from 7 years to 10 years. So you wouldn't be able to become a free agent until you'd had, 10 years of service under your belt. The players, again, wanted that fixed cap. They didn't want it tied to league revenue. So ultimately, it's kind of one of those ones where we do get hockey back. Everyone kind of wins, but everyone also kind of loses in the sense that no one really kind of gets what they want. They do limit the contract extensions to 8 years if you're with the team, 7 years for free agents. They don't end up really getting that what they want in terms of pushing that free agency period up to 10 years. I forget where they ended up leaving it at. But they do bring revenue share back down to 50-50. So the advantage that the players had at that point is gone after this lockout. They're now splitting it evenly with the owners. And yeah, I mean, I remember this one pretty vividly. Obviously, I was still, around, just I think going into university in the 2004-05 lockout. But this is one where you're just kind of waiting and hoping that, is this going to happen, or is it going to go the other way? Are we actually going to lose an entire season again? This is, I think, really at my point where obviously I was kind of always been a crazy hockey fan and interested in all that, but this is really kind of when I started getting more and more into fantasy hockey, and you start to think about the fantasy hockey implications of not being able to play the season, and what are you going to do with your players that you had kept? Is anyone going to trade you for them? All those things, right? So, but those are kind of the key points, that we kind of talk about from there.
Yeah, I'll take my sidebar here as well. When this season resumed, I remember, much like you were saying, I was just distraught over the fact that there was no hockey, because that's what I look forward to every year. The start of the hockey season, the entire way through. When news came through on January 6th, when they reached the agreement, I was ecstatic. And there was a bar right down the street from where I was living. I was still living with mom and dad. And I went there, and I'm watching the game. And the Flyers are starting to lose to the Penguins. I'm pissed off. I left, came home, watched the rest of the game at the house because my mom's a big Flyers fan as well. So we sat there and sulked together. At least I had somebody who had a shoulder I could cry on after that game. But regardless, much to John's point with the last lockout, the 04-05, this is Bettman's third stoppage of play as commissioner of the NHL. Now, I understand that he is representing the owners, so I'm sure the owners are happy because they're getting kind of what they want, and Bettman is at the forefront of that. As the players, when you're not getting, they're taking away some of the revenue, they're, implementing all these rules and all these changes. Let's say, Mike, you're an NHL player. How does this sit with you after this lockout? And the current CBA is set to expire here shortly, if I'm not mistaken. Are you looking forward to another potential lockout because there's going to be some other issue that arises that owners are going to say, we want to change that, and we're going to put our foot down until it's changed?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a player, obviously you're always going to be looking for, the path of least resistance in order to help you better do your job. But ultimately, by the same token, I think a lot of these players are smart and acute to realize that if something is unfair, they're willing, and they've had, taken this stance in the past, to kind of fight for what they believe to be fair and right, not only for their careers, but the careers of players that are kind of coming up beneath them, right? And so it's interesting now because as the league, is increasingly getting younger, especially now more than ever, you're going to have a new group of players who are going to kind of come into potentially the next lockout or labor shortage or stoppage, who've never really kind of gone through this before, right? I mean, you've got a lot of players who were obviously around from the 2012-13 lockout, but with the way the league is trending with the young players, it's a whole new crop here who've never encountered this before. And are they going to view this the same way as their predecessors? Odds are they will, because you're still going to have all of that veteran presence around at that time. But it's going to be interesting to see when you've never had a group that's experienced this before. I mean, this is now we're kind of coming up on 8 years out from the last one, which was, I guess roughly the same time from the 2004-05 to the 2012 one that we're talking about now. But a lot in the league has changed since then, right? And so it really will be interesting to see how it is handled by, I think, some of those younger group of players who are increasingly, that is how the league is marketing itself now, right? It's to these young players who are tearing it up. They're fast. They're fun to watch. It'll be interesting, to say the least.
Yeah, and I find another thing that's interesting is kind of what this COVID-19, how they've had to address this. Like, they can't afford to have a lockout. Like, that could be crippling for the NHL if you essentially lose the rest of the season, possibly even can't award a Stanley Cup, and then what is it, 2-3 years from now, or is it even sooner? The next CBA. Does anybody know?
I'm not familiar.
2 years?
2 years?
Yes. I'm not sure. I'd have to look it up.
Well, I mean, just imagine that then there's a lockout. I mean, fans, including me, will be pissed.
Absolutely.
And once again, the popularity of this sport, for for the casual fans is going to take a hit. I mean, you'll always have your hardcore fans, but I find that that's the biggest problem with the NHL. Whenever the popularity starts to rise, something like a lockout happens.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think the other thing too that's worth noting as well is Seattle, right? I mean, that's the last thing that Bettman would want is another lockout, as they're getting ready to bring another club into the league, especially, if you're recording, like you're now dealing with those owners who are now part of the group to say, like, I paid you, $500 million, why am I not getting my product on the ice? And so, I mean, I think from that perspective, I agree that, again, with all the revenue lost, and then having another lockout, potentially, turning the fans away that have been brought on board, but then also the Seattle thing is another, I think, key point that'll kind of determine how maybe the NHL and the league side approaches this lockout. Maybe they won't be as iron-fisted as they have been in the past. I doubt it, but ultimately I think they have just as much to lose, this time around as the players do in this case, because they're the ones that are going to want this to kind of happen, right? And so we kind of see how they're potentially looking at the Olympics as maybe kind of a lever they could use, although, in my opinion, and I'm sure in the opinion of a lot of the players, the Olympics shouldn't be a bargaining chip, but that's, for the owners and for Bettman, it seems to be that's the case. Whether or not that will fly and they'll take that as that to try to help us get through and get that next CBA ratified and avoid a stoppage remains to be seen. But it'll be, I think, especially with COVID right now, that's something that no one could have anticipated as having an impact on the next round of negotiations.
Yeah. You almost have to kind of chalk it up to, some sort of a mulligan because, like you said, this is unforeseen. No one knew this was going to happen. No one knew that the season was going to be put on hold, with the potential of the Stanley Cup not being awarded. And much to that point with the Stanley Cup, we go back to the lockout in 2004-2005. There was a movement that arose during that lockout to free the Stanley Cup, and it was later granted around that time so that if the NHL did cancel the season, the Cup could be awarded to another team in another league. So to kind of cap this off, let's have a little bit of fun with it. Can we say right now that if there is no Stanley Cup winner this year from the NHL, is there another league that the Stanley Cup could be awarded in?
Are they playing?
I would say no, because there definitely was like a free the cup movement at that time, and even like among beer league teams saying, can we the cup? But I think probably one of the more credible ones that came out through that period was at the time Canada's Governor General Adrian Clarkson had suggested that the women's national teams between Canada and the U.S. play for the cup. And I don't know how far that actually got in the official process, but it was later reported that that wasn't going to happen. And so, this is now, 16 years out from the last time. So it's certainly possible. I think that just in this case, given that we're, if this was a lockout, I'd probably be a little more optimistic. But the fact that nobody can play anything now, I think would be the one reason why we probably wouldn't see that. Although it would be pretty hilarious if you had some, amateur leagues or men's leagues, even for that matter, or women's leagues for that matter, kind of playing for the Stanley Cup. That way you can finally live out that childhood dream that so few of us have wanted, but obviously would never get to.
Little did you know, there's actually a group of scientists in Antarctica that have a league. And
oh, yeah?
No, I'm making this up.
No. It's the scientists against the penguins and the polar bears. Like it's,
right. We could award the cup to one of them.
I was going to say, I thought this was like the second sidebar, and I was hoping that there was that somehow in this outpost somewhere that they have a regular season that they play, and I'd be all for that. I'd be all for any hockey at this point. So if we can play in Antarctica safely, then let's do it.
Let's do it. Ship them down there. Let's go.
How cool would that be, though, to see a women's team win the Stanley Cup? Like, how awesome would that be to see just these incredible athletes that are women holding up that Stanley Cup? Like, it's groundbreaking, it's revolutionary, but like you said, everybody's dream. Like, these women have the same dream that these guys do in the NHL. How cool would that be for them to be able to realize that and say, I hoisted the Stanley Cup, like, we won it?
Yeah, no, I think it would be, everyone kind of, the Stanley Cup is arguably the best trophy in all of sports. So I think, anybody would love to hoist that. I mean, ultimately, I think the other thing that's kind of interesting, too, about the fact that Clarkson was the one who really pushed for that is that when they ended up forming, the Canadians Women Hockey League. The trophy that they award there is the Clarkson Cup. And it's obviously named in honor of Adrienne Clarkson, much like the way that the Stanley Cup is named after, Governor General Lord Stanley.
Yeah. Well, we've gotten through all the lockouts, the work stoppages. Let's hope that we can get some hockey back on the tube here because, quite frankly, I want it back. I'm going crazy right now.
Yeah, and I do have a question for you, Mike. Based off of all of these other, I know it's different because they were lockouts, and I mean you have to go back to 1919 for a pandemic. But when do you think the league would have to be able to start playing again? Even if they canceled the season and started up with playoffs, when do you think they'd have to start that up in order for us to have a playoff and award a Stanley Cup for this season?
Yeah, that's interesting because I've seen that players' proposal that was kind of circulating on TSN, maybe a couple of weeks ago, where they were looking at, coming back and having a training camp, in like a camp in June or July, so they can finish the regular season, and then you would play the playoffs, kind of August, September, and then you would kind of come back, within a month or two and run the next season, right? And to me, I don't think those timelines really make any sense. I mean, the COVID situation is changing day by day, and I think it's more and more likely that it's not really going to be possible, I think, to get back in time to do in such a comprehensive way. It's a tough one, right? Because ultimately we've seen what's happened when players go on bye weeks and like how out of shape they are, not out of shape, but like it does take them a few games to get kind of back into the rhythm. We've seen injuries coming off right after a bye week. These guys now, like we're all been in quarantine for, 3-4 weeks, some of us. And so by the time this happens, like there's a lot of rust that they're going to have to shake off. And for me, as much as like, the regular season is, you have to kind of cap that off to find out how we're going to do the playoffs. But to think that we're going to do the regular season and finish off those remaining 10, 11 games, like I think let's all be realistic that that's not going to happen. And as much as I want hockey back, like I don't think it's even realistic at this point now to think that we're going to get the playoffs this year, unless the league was to look at something potentially where you did those playoffs later in the summer, early into the fall, and then you somehow shortened the following regular season, which is going to be a non-starter because of obviously all the hockey-related revenue that goes with those games. But I don't know how you would get the players to sign off necessarily to do the playoffs throughout the summer, really only take like a month or two off and then go right back at it. But again, if you've kind of heard what the players are talking about, a lot of them, that they want to see the conclusion of the season, right? They've all worked so hard to get to this point that I guess even if it isn't a different, iteration from what we normally used to, I think they want to kind of see it come to conclusion. But it's just kind of, given how everything kind of changes from day to day, week to week, it's so hard to say what it'll look like.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I keep saying over and over again on this show, this season's going to have an asterisk on it. I don't want next season to have one too.
Yeah, there was I think I forget who it was, but like Greg Wyshynski quote tweeted, it was somebody whose idea was that you'd make a mega season where you would just like, this season's done, we're not going to get it back, we're not going to have the playoffs, we're not going to finish the regular season. You just then tack on the next regular season to this, so all of the points and all of the games carry over.
Oh, wow.
And you have this like 140 game season. Is as much as there's probably a lot of holes you could poke into that if you actually sat down and thought about it. I think I just want mega season, and just to see what that would look like and how all the hockey purists would their heads would explode when Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl have like 250 points because they combine all the games. And now Wayne Gretzky doesn't have the season single season records anymore. It would be wonderful.
That's an interesting point. That would be wild.
Yeah.
Well, again, we've gotten through all these. Mike, we'd like to thank you for coming on and sharing your insight here, talking a little bit about some of the shortages and some of the seasons that we missed some play. Once again, please let us know where we can all find you, social media, all that type of stuff.
Yeah, no, thanks again, guys. Appreciate it. It's always great to come on and chat, especially now. At least talking about hockey kind of makes up for not watching hockey. But yeah, you can find all my stuff on Twitter is primarily where I post it. So it's at Mike Commito. I'm still doing some writing for the Kings right now. So in the next couple of weeks, hopefully have some new stories out. And then in the meantime, every day there's new hockey history moments. So go check that out if you want your hockey history fix. And yeah, that's basically how you can find me these days. If I'm not playing with my Super Deker, I've got this like hockey skills game now where it's like a video game, but you're actually using your stick and this puck that has a magnet, and it's insane. It's very addictive. So at least when I get out of this quarantine, I'll have better hands than I did before, which isn't saying much.
So we might be seeing Mike Commito playing in the NHL in the next couple of years. Who knows?
I'm gunning for that next contract.
Perfect. Hopefully a CBA dispute doesn't get in the way.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again, Mike. We really appreciate you taking the time to spend hanging out with us on a Sunday night talking some hockey here.
Yeah, no, my pleasure, guys. Thank you.
Have a great rest of your night, Mike.
Yeah, you too. Thanks. Cheers.
Always great having Mike on to talk some hockey. I mean, that guy, I'll be honest, he's one of the more brilliant minds that I've come across covering, talking, and just watching hockey.
Well, yeah, because, I mean, he takes the time to look back in history. You know, I always appreciate people like that. I'm a history person in general, you know, especially like American history. So I kind of have an appreciation for just like looking into the past. And what I like about it is he just doesn't like regurgitate what happened in the past. He tries to apply it to the present, you know, and kind of say how the present might go based off of things in the past. And it really makes for an interesting conversation.
He's the exact opposite of me, because that's all I do is regurgitate what happened, you know?
Right.
But yeah, so, I mean, let's be honest, we could put a bow on this right now. I think we covered a lot of what we wanted to, and we gave some people something to listen to that is worth their while, because let's be honest, again, for probably the 30th time, there is no hockey to watch, which sucks.
Right.
So, I mean, John, tell us where they can find them, or where they can find us. Ugh.
Okay, well, you can find us on Twitter at PodSTBullies. You can find us on your various podcasting thingamabobbers like iTunes and Spreaker and Spotify, and my favorite, Podmuncher.
There it is.
The only problem is now when you go to Podmuncher, you have to make sure you're wearing gloves and a mask.
They still have you punch in your birthday as well?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, they're thinking about also doing facial recognition just because it's getting a little crazy.
That makes sense. I get it.
Yeah, you know what I'm finding, man?
Yeah?
I'm having a really hard time communicating with people. Like talking.
I don't say.
This is all very strange to me, like having a conversation with somebody else.
Other than your wife or your daughter.
Or the person in my head, and I typically don't have to talk out loud for that one.
Oh, yeah. That guy just, you know, he tags along most of the time for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so with that being said, you can find John on Twitter at PodStreetGove. You can find me on Twitter, Derek, at PodStreetBob. This has been the Pod Street Bullies. I guess we're not going to call it the Pod Street Pub because we actually had a guest on to talk some actual hockey stuff. But I'll always leave you with, let's go Flyers.
Bye now.